In this tutorial, I'm going to show you step by step how to model a detailed tree in Modo. Now, at first you might think this is a fairly intimidating subject to tackle because obviously there's a lot of detail that you need to create, a lot of little branches, the foliage, etc. But actually you'll find that by leveraging several parts of Modo's toolset, this job can actually be achieved very, very quickly. And the method that I'm going to demonstrate is going to be split into two parts. The first part is where I'm going to be using more or less traditional modeling methods to create the main shape of the tree, the trunk, the bigger branches, some of the smaller branches. And obviously the reason why you need to use more traditional methods to create these kinds of shapes is because you need precision. You need to be able to control the shapes that you're creating because you're either following some reference or a specific design, or at the very least you have a shape in mind that you want to try and stick to. However, the method that I'm going to show you is going to be extremely quick because we're going to be using Sketch Extrude and the Mesh Paint feature in order to create all of the branch detail very, very quickly. And in the second part of this two-step process, I'm going to use the particle system in conjunction with the ability to create curves from particles in order to generate all of the smaller branches that the actual foliage is growing from. And next I'll show you how you can use the hairstyling tools in order to control the curves that you've just created with the particle system, and this will enable you to create accurate shapes for your branches very, very quickly without getting bogged down into creating individual handcrafted detail. So it's time to get started. I've got an empty scene open in Modo, and I'm going to start by creating a unit cube, just holding down Control and clicking on the cube icon. And then I'm going to, making sure I'm in item mode, I'm going to go to Edit, Center to Bounding Box, and I'm going to put that to the bottom. And then I'm just going to go to the Y position and just zero it out. So basically this is just for reference. And what I'm now going to do is to make this 10 meters tall. So let me just activate my transform tool and then bring this up to 9 meters, which should make the entire thing 10 meters tall. If I go to view and enable my dimensions tool, we should see that the entire mesh is 10 meters by 1 meter by 1 meter. And the reason that I'm creating this 10-meter high box is just so that while I'm modeling the tree, I've just got some quick visual reference in the viewport so that I can see roughly how high my tree is. That doesn't mean that I'm going to stick to 10 meters. I'm probably going to make my tree a bit taller than that in the end, but it's just so that I can see more or less where I am. So I'm just going to make sure that this mesh doesn't render. So where it says render, I'm going to say no, and I'm going to go to the display and just tick bounding box. And that means that this will always be displayed as a bounding box in my viewport, and that it will never render. I'm also going to just hide the dimensions tool because I don't really need that anymore. And now I'm going to hover over my item list and hit N to create a new mesh, and this is going to serve as the basis for my trunk. Now you can see that I'm tumbling in the viewport, and it's just one thing that you need to be aware of in Modo is sometimes the work plane sort of floats in an undesirable position, which is exactly what's happening right now. You can see my work plane is kind of halfway up the reference box, and if I just shift slightly in my viewport, you'll see it snaps down to the bottom. I find this behavior actually a little bit annoying, so what I'm going to do is I tumble the viewport until I've got the work plane oriented in the axis that I want it to, and then I just hit page down just to zero it on the world center because that's where I want to start my modeling from. And now I'm going to create another cube in my new mesh item, and obviously this is going to be quite a lot smaller. So I'm just going to bear with me just while I quickly draw out a shape. Doesn't have to be super precise, but this is going to kind of do. Let's just pull something up and then drop the cube tool. So in order to create the trunk from here, I'm going to go to polygon mode. I'm just going to turn snapping off, and I'm going to go to my polygon tab, and there's a really cool tool here called Sketch Extrude, and this is what I'm going to use to draw the trunk, because it's going to give me a nice organic shape. So I'm going to select the top polygon, I'm going to activate the Sketch Extrude tool, and I'm going to change a couple of settings here. I'm going to change the scale to 80, and this means that my shape is going to taper as it gets taller, just like a real tree would. I'm also going to put some spin on this, because the spin means that it's going to twist the shape as I extrude it out, and this is really useful because it means that the branches that I pull out from this four-sided object aren't always going to be at the same angle, so it gives a much nicer, more organic result. So now I'm going to click on my viewport to activate the tool. I'm just going to orient my viewport, and then I'm just going to start dragging. Now you can see that my settings aren't working here. They're a bit too aggressive, so I need to change the spin maybe to just 5. That's much better. And I think my scale is also way too strong, so just change that back. Might even change the spin down to 3 just to make it more subtle. Now, one of the problems with the Sketch Extrude tool is it can sort of veer wildly off, so you have to sort of keep rotating as you extrude. Now, obviously, if you're trying to do a tree that that's got a really funky shape, then this is kind of to your benefit. But if you want to do a straighter tree, you might have to edit the extrusion. Now, this is something you can do afterwards by changing the mode anyway, so you do have that ability, and I think for this tree I'm going to do that. I'm just going to change the scale again to about 95. The great thing is that while the tool is live, you can change all the parameters, and then obviously update in the viewport. So let's extrude it up to here. Let's move the scale back down a bit. I do want it to thin out a bit. And what I'm going to do here, I think the shape is actually pretty good, but this big kink here at the start is a little bit annoying. So I'm going to just go to Edit Path, and then just go in and just fix some of these shapes. And I can also delete some of the points. The only drawback with deleting the points is it will actually affect the faces on the extrusion, so it means that I'll have fewer faces, but as the extrusion is a little bit irregular, I'm not too bothered by that, so I might actually go to delete not, and just where they're dense and a little bit too complicated, I'm going to delete some of them just to simplify the shape and make my twist a little bit smoother. Go back to Edit Path, and now I can start bringing this back in, and you can see you've got quite a lot of control over the shape. So I think I'm going to settle on this. It's a good start. So now I'm going to drop my Sketch Extrude tool. It's going to hide the verts for now. That was a Control-1 pie menu, just in case you weren't sure. And select the bottom face, and I'm just going to hit B to bevel it, and just click in the viewport, and then drop the tool. And now I'm going to deselect everything and Shift Tab to put SDS Subdivide on, and this is giving me the basic trunk shape of my tree. And the next step is to create some of the bigger branches. So I'm just going to start selecting some faces, and I'm just going to quickly hit the B key just to bevel them once, then drop the bevel tool and go back to my Sketch Extrude, and then click on the selected face. Rotate the viewport, and then just drag out a branch. So I want to make the scale a bit smaller now because I want it to taper in more aggressively. So just find the right setting. Now you can change a few things here. I can add a bit more spin if I want. You might be wondering what the precision does. Basically, the higher precision, the fewer spans it's going to create, and it's going to try and follow your mouse more closely. It doesn't really follow it all that well in 3D. You'll always find it's going to veer off sort of behind the axis that is shown on screen. So if you're dragging out like this, you'll find it's going to be going backwards in space. So I tend to leave the precision around 30 or 50. That seems to work for me, because if it's too low, then it creates too many spans and they're a little bit sort of jumbled up. And if it's too high, then you just don't have enough spans. But this branch seems more or less okay. I'm just going to maybe reduce the scale actually a little bit more, try about 60 so it really tapers off, and drop that, and let's just select another face here, hit B to bevel it out, and then get the sketch extrude, drag out another branch. So you can see what I mean, that it always seems to go back in screen space as you drag a branch out, but you can always come back and edit the path if you're not that happy with it. But as long as you create enough branches, it's not going to be enough of a problem. So I'm just going to activate the bevel tool first, just to bevel it once, and then Alt B to activate sketch extrude. And let's draw out this branch, and then once again you can see that it sort of zooms off into the sort of behind screen space, but that's okay. I'm just gonna live with that for now. So I'm just gonna pause the video now while I just extrude some more branches, but you can see that the process is extremely rapid. And if you're not happy with the shapes that you're dragging out, you can always go back and edit the curve as long as you haven't dropped the sketch extrude tool. So I've just pulled a few more branches out, and you can see I've got some pretty nice shapes going on lower down, but the branches at the top I'm not at all happy with, because the spans there are too thick really for the size of branch that I need at the very top of the tree. They're sort of looking a bit fat. So what I'm going to do is hit F3 to bring up my sculpt palette, and I'm simply going to select the smooth tool and just right click to drag out a brush shape, and then I'm just going to very gently smooth out these branches just to make them thinner and make sure they taper off nicely at the end. And you can see just by doing this I get a much more believable shape. And obviously if you mess up and go a bit too far, just hold down Control, or maybe get the inflate tool rather, and just re-inflate, and then hold down Shift to smooth out again. Let me just bring out my brush size there. Go, and you can see it's very quick to get a nice pleasing result. So I'm just going to drop the sculpt tool, close this palette, and the next thing I'm going to think about is creating another set of smaller branches which are going to sit on top of these much bigger branches. So I'm going to hit N to create another mesh, and then I'm going to bring up the viewport properties by hitting O, and I'm just going to set my inactive meshes to wireframe so that I got a reference for the trunk while I create the branches. So we just go back to my basic tools, and once again I'm just going to create a little cube. This time it needs to be much thinner than the trunk, because obviously this is for the smaller branches. Drag out the cube, drop the tool once again, select the top polygon, and once again hit Alt B to sketch extrude this, and I'm just gonna quickly sketch extrude. This can be quite a twisty shape. It doesn't really matter because I'm going to create several of them, and you really want it to be quite twisty to make it more believable as a branch. So now I'm going to drop the tool. I'm also going to click in the viewport to drop the selection. I'm going to select the polygon on the bottom, and I'm going to hit B to bevel it, drop the bevel tool, deselect, Shift Tab to put it into STS mode. And now what I need to do is just to sort of create some extra branches on here. So I could just Alt B to sketch extrude right from here. Sometimes I bevel the polygon and sometimes I don't. It doesn't really matter. It kind of depends what kind of shape you want. But here, because I wanted to get the feel of a main branch, I didn't bevel first. So the more of these details you can add, the nicer it's going to be. Just make sure that you select a polygon that's relatively even, not too uneven, so that your branch shape is nice and smooth, because otherwise you're going to get a very sort of fat bottom to your branch, which you might not want. But of course you can always come back and use the sculpt tools, which I'm going to do here. Let's bring up the sculpt tools. I'll use the inflate, but by using Shift, it's going to smooth rather than inflate, and just refine my shape nicely. I'll drop that and hide that palette once again, and I think I'll just extrude another of these polygons. So this time I'm going to bevel, I think. So I hit B, and now I'll sketch extrude from there, smaller branch. Undo that, didn't really like it. It seemed a bit wild the way it extruded out. So my viewport's slowing down a bit because of the video capture. I'll try that extrusion again, but just in a more controlled manner. That seems to work a bit better. I'll deselect, bring up my sculpt tools once again, grab this inflate tool, right click to shape it, and then hold down Shift to smooth that out, and maybe just re-inflate this branch. So what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to pause the video, but I'm going to create a few more of these branches, just using exactly the same technique. But the idea is that once I'm done, I've got a selection of branches that I can choose from, because then I'm going to mesh paint them onto the actual tree. So I've created a few more of these branches, 5 in total, and you can see I've also tidied up my item list by giving everything descriptive names. And I've just tried to add a little bit of variation in the branches. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to select all 5 of them, and in component mode I'm going to use the bend tool, and I want to bend them upwards. The reason for this is I want the branches, when I use mesh paint to drop them onto the tree, I want them to look as if they're growing upwards, because it depends on the species of tree. If you've got like a willow-like tree, sometimes the branches actually grow downwards, but in most cases the branches are going to grow in an upward fashion to try and get the leaves to reach more light. So let me just select my bend tool. Here it is, and I need to hit end to reset my work plane, because the bend tool uses the work plane. So basically where you click in the viewport is going to place the tool handle at the intersection of the work plane and the point at which you clicked. So I'm just going to drag this up, and I'm then just going to bend all of these into the same direction, so that when I place them on the tree, they'll look as if they're growing upwards. So now I'm going to paint these branches onto the main trunk. So I'll select the main trunk in component mode, and in my duplicate tab I'm going to select the mesh paint tool. Now I just want the regular mesh paint tool, I don't want instances or replicas at this point, so just the normal mesh paint tool. And as my paint mode I'm going to use drop, because that's the most versatile option. And then as my source I'm going to select specific mesh, and then I'm going to basically alternate between all these branches which I've just created. So let's start by selecting branch 1, and then just at the top of my trunk, just dragging out the shape, and you can see that I can control the scale and rotation of the branch as I create it. So using this, I'm going to be able to create some detail very, very quickly on this tree. And because I've got 5 different branches and I can scale them and rotate them all individually, I'm going to have a lot of variety here. So you can see that it's very, very quick to add detail. So let me change to the next shape that I want to add, and let's add a shape onto here, making sure that it's always pointing upwards. And then I'll move to the next shape I've got, and then drag one out, say here. And obviously, because these are actually individual meshes that I'm creating, I can always go and alter them individually. So if you're not happy with the shape of one of the branches you pull out, you can always use the sculpt tools, for instance, to edit it, or you can isolate it and just scale it individually. So in this case, let's say I want to do this, and select this and Shift H to hide everything else, and then let me just select the polygon at the end, and let me just hover over it and hit home, so I can put my work plane at the base of this, and then I can unhide the rest of the tree, and then double click to select all of this. And now if I select my scale tool by hitting R and then Alt W to go to origin, I can now stretch this out, change the shape of it. Once I'm happy with the shape, I'll just drop the selection, hit end to reset my work plane, and then I can just go back to my mesh paint tool and then select the next one of these branches that I want to add. And so you can see it really doesn't take very long to start adding a lot of detail. So once again, I'm just going to pause the video and just finish this mesh paint operation to my satisfaction. So I've gone around and just sort of quickly dropped some more of these branches onto the trunk. I've been careful to try and add some to the tips of the trunk, just to, you know, create some more detail branching off. And of course, if there's any editing that you need to do to any of the individual branches, now's a good time to do it. So for instance, I think this one's a little bit too fat, so I'm just going to double click it, and in my deform tab, I'm going to select the push tool, and then just quickly just thin it out a fraction. Obviously, most of these branches are going to be completely hidden by the foliage once I've added that, but you can see it's very flexible. You can still have a lot of control over the branches. Once you drop them, you can go back and edit them in case you just want to, just sort of tweak your design. So with that done, I'm now going to start thinking about creating the smaller branches, and this is something I'm going to do procedurally rather than doing by hand. So the first problem that I'm faced with when wanting to create my smaller branches procedurally is that obviously I don't want them to grow all over the tree. I don't want any smaller branches on the base of my tree. I want them all in the upper branches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a gradient on the actual mesh in order to control where the particles that are going to generate the branches are going to be emitted from. So let's go to the render tab, and I'm just going to quickly hide these branches. I don't need them anymore. And I'm going to go to my base material, and I'm just going to add a gradient, and I'm going to set the input parameter to surface parameters thickness. So basically what this is going to allow me to do is to have a different color on the thin parts of the mesh than I would have on the thick parts of the mesh. And the idea behind this is that obviously I want my smaller branches to only grow where the trunk itself is thin. So it's by using this gradient, which I'm going to later convert to a weight map, that I'll be able to control exactly where the particles are generated. So just before I go and edit the gradient, I'm going to change its effect from diffuse color to diffuse amount. And the reason for this is that if I was to leave it at diffuse color, I would have 3 values to edit, because the diffuse color is defined as RGB, and that makes editing the curves in the gradient editor much more fiddly. So by changing it to diffuse amount, it means that I've only got really one set of values to play with, just one curve rather than 3. So with that done, I'm just going to let's middle click somewhere here on this line, and I'm just going to drag the value down, and you can see that my preview is updating as I do this. So basically this is the tip of the branches, and this is the base where it's set to 0. So it's simply a case of just adjusting this until I get the effect that I want. And I'm just going to hit A here to resize my gradient editor. And so what I want to do, I'm just going to hold shift and zoom in to preview with my scroll wheel. What I want to do is basically to make the thinner parts of the branches white, and obviously the thicker parts of the branches black. And I can obviously edit the curve in a number of ways to achieve this. So pretty straightforward. I'm already pretty close to what I want. I'm just going to make it a little bit steeper, and you can see that essentially the black areas are not going to have any small branches growing on them, and the white areas are going to have smaller branches. So I think I'm pretty happy with that. I'm just going to hold down shift and zoom out of preview once again. And the next step in the process is to convert this gradient into a weight map, because with a weight map it's really easy to control particle density. So what I'm going to do, let me just restore my viewport. I'm just going to change this to VMap, because it'll enable me to see the results of what I'm doing. And there's a really easy way to bake this diffuse amount map as an illumination vertex map, and I can then convert that into a standard weight map. So the first step is to disable all the lights in my scene. In this case, I've only got this one directional light, so it's very quick. And then I'm going to go to the render item, GI tab, and I'm going to disable global illumination. And then I'm going to set my ambient intensity to 1. And as I do this, you can see that my gradient is visible in preview once again. And then I'm just going to make sure I select my tree, and then I'm going to go to Vertex Map, Vertex Illumination Baking, and make sure that Enable GI is unticked, and then I click OK. And as soon as I do that, you can see that the weight map has been created. So now it's simply a case of going back to the Render tab, setting the ambient intensity back to 0, re-enabling GI, re-enabling the lights. And the next step now is to convert this illumination vertex map into a standard weight map. So I need to create a new weight map. So I'm going to make sure I've still got my trunk selected. I'm going to go to the vertex map list. And if I look under other maps, I can see my illumination map is there. I'm just going to create a new weight map, call it weight. That's absolutely fine. And now I'm going to go to vertex map math. And as my destination, I'm going to select the weight map that I've just created. Vertex map A is going to be my illumination map. And now all I need to do is to click OK, and it's basically going to transfer the information from the illumination map to my new weight map. And the benefit of using this approach is that obviously I don't need to go in and paint the weight map by hand, which on all these very small branches could end up being quite fiddly. However, having created the weight map procedurally, I can then go and edit it by hand. So it's worth going over to the paint tab and just making sure that you don't have any unwanted weights on parts of the model where you don't want them, for instance on the bottom part of the trunk or around this sort of branch base here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make sure I've got my weight map selected, and I'm going to go to the erase tool. I'm just going to drag out and I'm just going to unpaint the values that are added here, and I can just go through and edit, but obviously this is a much faster process than sort of painting from scratch. And then once I'm happy with where the weight map is being applied, I can simply drop the tool. And next I'm going to go to the Setup tab because it's time to create my particle system. So you have to be pretty careful if you want to use a weight map. I can't use the surface generator under simulation because that doesn't have an option to use a weight map. So I'm going to have to start with a point cloud, and I'm going to go to surface particle generator. Now the disadvantage of this is that it creates static particles, but it does allow me to use a weight map. So I'm going to then need to add another modifier to turn it into a dynamic simulation. So let's start with a source surface, and I'm going to choose my trunk. And as my density VMAP, I'm going to select weight. And you can see as soon as I do that, the particles are isolated to the thinner branches as defined by the gradient that I created earlier. Now, I probably want to change the average spacing and the particle sealing in order to get something more pleasing. It's going to be a little bit of trial and error at this stage because obviously it's not always that obvious without actually running the simulation and creating the curves. I'm not necessarily going to be able to judge my results. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run through the process roughly, and if I need to come back and readjust it, then I will later. So in order to convert this surface particle generator into an actual dynamic simulation, I need to go back to the particles, and I'm going to go to simulation, and I'm going to go to source emitter this time. And as my source, I can choose my surface particle generator. And as soon as I do that, if I activate the simulation, you can see that it's generating dynamic particles from my branches. So what I need to do is to run the simulation just roughly, just to see what the initial results give me, and then convert that to a curve. And then we can see if that is going to be usable as a basis for my branches. So I'm going to go to the simulation compute, and I'm just going to compute it over the length of the scene. Doesn't take very long. Just go to the end, and you can see I've generated my particles. So now if I go to my particle simulation item and go to the dynamics menu, I can convert the particles to curves. So you go convert particle cache particles to curves, and you can see that's creating some curves on my tree. Now obviously this isn't the end result that I want. This is just a starting point. I'm able to see if these results are usable, and a couple of things spring to mind. I would say that they're far too dense to start with, and I think they're also far too long. So basically I'm going to undo my steps. So let's just go back, and well, that's fine. And now go to my surface particle generator, and I'm going to increase my minimum spacing. I think I don't want them too close together. So let's put that to 20 millimeters. And I'm going to increase my average spacing. Let's just add a 0 in there. Now it's quite likely there's going to be quite a lot of toing and froing. That's obviously one of the things you have to do. You have to do quite a lot of tweaking when you're creating a system like this, but that's fine. I'm going to also make sure that my particles don't emit quite so far. So I'm going to reduce the velocity. Let's divide it by 5. And once again, I'm just going to compute the simulation. You can see now my particles are much closer to the branches. Now I think this is probably not going to work. I think I've sort of dialed it back too far, but let's Select the particle simulation and once again go to convert particle cache, particles to curves. Now pretty much as I thought, I don't have enough branches, they're too concentrated in some areas, I need to adjust the settings. So once again I'm going to undo this and let's go back to the surface particle generator. Let's change my average spacing, let's put it down to 0.25, my minimum spacing. Let's just see what that does in terms of where it generates the particles. They seem to be a better spread. Let's reduce the minimum spacing. Let's also reduce the average spacing a little bit. Let's recompute the simulation. Okay, now go back to my source emitter. I might increase the initial velocity, let's say up to 150, and let's reduce the spread. Let's put that down to 100. I think that basically just controls how much variation there is in terms of the length of the curves that I'm eventually going to generate. So once again, I'm going to compute the simulation. And once again, select the particle simulation item, go to dynamics, and convert particle cache to curves. Now this is a much more usable result. You can see that it's starting to look like branches. I'm getting the distribution that I want. Now obviously they're far too straight, but that's something that's really easy to fix. But I think for now I'm happy with this result. So I'm going to expand my particle simulation and just grab the mesh, which is these curves which have just been created, and I'm going to drag it out of the particle simulation, just parent it to the trunk item, and I'm going to rename it branches just so that I know exactly what's what. And having done that, I can now switch to the paint tab and go to the hair tools. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of look from the bottom upwards, and I'm going to get the blow tool, and I'm just going to basically blow these, and it's going to make every curve point upwards. So it's just like blow drying some hair, and you can see it's had the desired results. It's obviously a little bit severe, but now I can go to the root puff tool and just drag that out. And if I paint rather with the root puff tool over these curves, you can see it's now sort of altering them in a very pleasing way for branches. It's really starting to create something that looks very much like a branch. And obviously I can use all of the hairstyling tools to shape my branches, and as you can see, I'm actually editing a very large number of curves very, very quickly. So it's a really effective way of creating some very believable branches very, very quickly. So it's just a case of going through. Now I'm finding that the length of all of these branches is a little bit even, and that's because I sort of reduced the difference in velocity between the different particles. It would have been better actually if I'd increased it slightly, but it's not a disaster because I can always come back and use the hairstyling tools in order to stretch some of my my curves. So I'm going to use the move tool now. Let's just sort of gradually move some of these branches so that they're a little bit more uneven. And if I hold shift, I can smooth them as well. And so it creates something a little bit more chaotic. And if I want to use the stretch tool, I can extend some of them out a little bit. You can see it's pretty subtle, but it allows me to make some of the branches a little bit longer. And I can also use the curl if I want to. For instance, let's just use that here. Let's make the tips a little bit less even, and holding down shift I can also smooth them out. So basically it's just a case of going through, maybe using the separate tool this time, going through and generally editing these branches until I'm happy with the shape. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pause the video and carry on this editing process. So I've carried on with my basic editing, and I use mostly the comb tool with the root puff tool to just get shapes that I'm happy with. I've also used the stretch tool to try and vary the length of the branches. Now, one of the things I'm thinking of is not just the actual shape of these branches, but also the kind of canopy that I want to generate in this tree. So that's something you should bear in mind, because obviously the density of your branches is also going to control what your canopy is going to look like. Having done that though, I'm now going to switch back to the render tab, and let me just maximize this preview, and I'm just going to hold shift to zoom in slightly. Go to my item list, and with my branches selected, I'm going to tick on render curves. Obviously at the moment they're way too thick. I need to make them a much more sensible radius, so let's change that to 10 millimeters. And as I do that, got something much nicer. I just need to taper them slightly, so I'm going to go to the radius gradient, and I'm just going to open in editor, and where it says 100%, I'm just going to click on that and just lower the value so that the branches taper to a fine point. You can see they're starting to look much better, and this is really starting to look like quite a detailed tree. Now obviously depending on how much realism you want, you can go back and carry on editing with the hair tools in order to get a really good shape, and obviously if you're using reference you can make an effort to match that quite closely. At the moment I've concentrated on getting a sort of sweep of branches that goes upwards, but again that depends on the species of tree that you're trying to match. So now that I've created all of the main branches, the next step is to create some leaves. Now I'm going to connect my leaves to the branches with stems, and these will also be created using the particle system and curves. But before I do that, I need to actually create a leaf. So I'm just going to switch to the model tab, and I'm just going to select this guide so I don't create a child here, and hit N to create a new mesh item. And I'm going to click on the cube icon, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a 10 centimeter cube. So let me just zero out the position, let me equal here, and simply put 100 millimeters. And now I'm just going to apply to create that cube there, and do Shift A so I can center in on it. So with my size reference created, I'm now going to add a backdrop item. And as the image, I am going to just load a scan that I took of a leaf. I simply collected a leaf in the park and scanned it on a flatbed scanner. So you can see that my backdrop item has come in really big compared to my reference cube, but that's very easy to fix. If I go to the backdrop item properties where it says pixel size 10 millimeters, basically it's saying that every pixel in this image should be 10 millimeters high. Well, I need to change that, and I know that in this case the value I need is 0.1 millimeters or 100 and you can see that now that I've entered that value, my backdrop image matches my 10 centimeter reference cube perfectly. So with that done, I can simply select my cube and delete it, and my backdrop is basically ready for me to use. So once again, I'm going to hover over the item list and hit the N key to create a new mesh, and then I'm going to hit 2 on my numeric keypad to switch to the front view. And now I'm going to select the pen tool, and I'm simply going to trace over this leaf. Now the idea here is that I'm going to try and create as few points as possible, because I want the geometry to be as light as possible. Now obviously this means that I won't really be able to have close-ups of these leaves, but there's a couple of things you can do if you need to have close-ups of your leaves. You can create a second set of leaves with sort of more resolution, a set of hero leaves if you like, or you can subdivide, because I'm going to slice this into quads so it can be subdivided once the geometry is created. But for my purposes here, I'm not actually going to subdivide, because I really want to try and keep the geometry as light as possible. So what I'm doing now as I create the right hand side of the leaf is I'm trying to match the height of the points on the left so that I can slice it up as quickly as possible. So almost finished, just going to add this point, add this point here, and then add one final point up at the top, slide it into place. Let's make sure that all of my geometry is inside the map so that I won't have too many problems when I'm UV mapping this later on. Oops, didn't mean to create a point there. Go. Just quickly tweak my shape. Make sure that all my points match up. I'm tempted. No, I think I'll leave it. So I'm just going to drop that now. So I'm just going to click to deselect the polygon, and I'm going to go to the Mesh Edit tab, and I'm going to select the Edge Slice tool. And what I'm going to do is simply connect up all these opposing verts. So once I've done the first slice, if I hold down Shift, I can then carry on slicing without dropping the tool. So what you have to do is when you've done one slice, you hold down Shift to select the starting point of the next slice, and obviously let go of Shift to actually do the slice. And then once again, hold down Shift and just connect up like this. Hold down Shift, release, click. Hold down Shift once again, release, click, and so on all the way down. So I can slice this up pretty speedily. And with that done, I can simply drop the slice tool. Now in this case, I'm also going to put a slice down the middle, and I'm going to do this in two parts. So once again, I'm going to hit C to reactivate the edge slice, and I'm just going to connect this this vertex here to sort of roughly the center of this edge here, and then I'm going to go onto this edge, and let me just roughly place it in the middle. You can see that I've got my snap value at 5%, so this means that I can snap at 5% increments on these edges, so it's dead easy to get the middle. And once I've done that, I'm now going to drop this tool, and I'm going to hit F11 to open my snapping preferences, going to make sure that on vertex, activate snapping, and now I'm just going to select the actual slice tool because this will slice through everything in one go. So it should snap to this vert and then snap to the vert at the end, and now I can drop the tool and I've got my leaf. And the reason I've split it down the middle is so that I can do a bit of sort of bending and distorting, because I'm going to create 3 or 4 different leaves. But before I do that, let's just quickly create a material. So in polygon mode with nothing selected, I'm going to hit M to bring up the set material, and I'm just going to create a leaf material. Take the specular down to say 2 and just apply it. And now I'm going to go to my UV tab and let's switch to the front view. And I'm simply going to go UV projection tool. Actually, I'm going to go project from view like so, and that should give me a nice projection for my material. I'm just going to go to my shader tree in my leaf material. I'm going to go image map. Let's use the clip browser because I've already got it loaded, my leaf, and let me just see how that works with the UVs. So I can see I need to just scale this in a little bit so that I don't have any sort of blank spots where the UVs are outside of the projected image. See, that's a pretty straightforward process. And let's drop my selection and go back to my item list and hide the backdrop item. And you can see that in GL now, my leaf looks pretty good. So this is a good time to name my mesh, so I'm going to call it leaf. And now I'm going to switch to my model view, and what I need to do basically is put this the tip of this stem at the world center, because if I try and replicate it now, it's going to sort of replicate from the center. The center is the bit that's going to attach to the meshes. If I was to activate the transform tool in item mode, you can see that's where the current sort of center of the meshes, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to go back to polygon mode, activate the rotate tool, holding down control. I'm just going to snap it into the plane there, then activate the move tool, and I'm just going to make sure that the tip is at the world center because that's the point at which the replicated leaves will attach to the point source. So you just zoom in and see that that's more or less what I want. Yeah, just move it slightly to one side, maybe just slightly back up like that. And now I can drop the tool, and now if I go back into item mode, you can see that's the point from which all the transforms are calculated. And next I'm just going to go to the shader tree and select my leaf material and make a few adjustments. So I'm going to reduce the diffuse amount, and the reason I'm reducing the diffuse amount is because I'm going to increase the subsurface scattering. And you need to always balance out your values, because if you have 80% diffuse amount and then you add subsurface scattering at 50%, you're going to have a total amount of light being diffused at 130%, which is obviously not physically correct. The values can't exceed 100%. They can be below 100% in case some energy is lost through absorption or whatever, but you can't exceed 100% if you want to have a proper energy conservation. So I'm going to reduce my diffuse amount to 40%. My specular, I'm going to leave at 2, put my Fresnel at 25. So the specular obviously also counts towards this total. So at the moment I've got 40% on my diffuse, my specular at 2. I'm going to put conserve energy on. I'm going to match specular, put blurry reflections. So my total is 42. So I'm going to go to my transparency, and in my subsurface amount, I know that with a total of 42, I can't exceed 58. So let's just put it at 50. So that allows for some energy to be lost through absorption because my total is 92. And I'm going to reduce the front weighting to 10%. That means that more of the light will be transmitted straight through the leaf rather than being diffused back out towards the light source. So the lower your front weighting is, the more sort of translucent your leaf is going to appear, and the higher your front weighting is, the more waxy your surface is going to appear to be. So finally, I just need to make sure my leaf is double-sided, and I also need to duplicate this diffuse color map and set it to, I can instance it in fact, and set the copy to be subsurface color. So let's do that now. And obviously I don't need to spend too much time setting up this material. It's pretty straightforward what I'm doing, because essentially this is a detail that's going to be seen from very far away. So apart from the very basics of energy conservation, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, for instance, if you really wanted to go to town, you could create a back-facing gradient and have a different map on the other side of the leaf. But I just think for the importance of this texture, I don't really want to spend a lot of time working on it, because it is something that's going to be seen from very far away. However, once I've replicated it onto the tree, I will come back and add some gradients so that we have a bit of color variation with the leaves. And with my shading done, I'm going to return to the item list, and I'm going to duplicate this leaf a couple of times so that I can have some variations. I'm going to leave the first one exactly as it is, and then I'm going to go to the Deform tab and edit the other three. So I'm going to switch to component mode, and I'm going to start on the first one by using the bend tool. So I'm going to make sure that I click at the base of the leaf, and then I'm just going to simply bend that upwards, drop the tool, and select the next one. And this time I'm going to let's use the twist tool, and again make sure I'm clicked near the top, and let's just sort of twist it out a bit so we've got a little bit of variation. I'll drop the tool and I'll reactivate it again this time, and just do the twist in the other direction. There we go. And let's go on the final one, and this time let's put another bend, but let's just bend it this way. And maybe do a further bend just this way. So obviously it's important to make sure that you do your deformations from the base of this stem, so that the the base of the object doesn't move too much. So that's given me a little bit of variation in terms of shape. So what I need to do now is just to make sure I drop all my selections. Let's go into item mode, drop all my selections, then select these 4 leaves, go to my groups, create a new group from selected items, and I'll call it leaves, and we can use this group as our prototype in the replicator we'll be creating later on. So with my leaves now created, I'm going to return to the setup tab and zoom out, because now I need to think about creating the actual canopy of leaves. So I've got all my branches already created. So the next step is to grow some smaller stems off all of these small branches that are growing on the tree. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all the stuff that relates to my previous particle simulation. It's all been frozen into curves, so I don't need this anymore. So I'm simply going to delete it all from the scene. And what I need to do now is to create a new item. So I'm going to go add item, particle simulation, and this time I'm going to add a curve emitter. And the curve I'm going to choose is going to be my branches. So if I go to source, I can just select branches as my source. And let's just play the sim to see what's happening. So you can see basically the particles are being emitted from the branches. Now I can alter the distribution curve, which I'm going to do actually. So I'm going to open this in the editor. And I want fewer particles to be emitted from the base of these branches, and obviously more of them to be emitted from the tips. So let me just enter a value of 100 and 100 in here. So you can see we've got a distribution curve, very sparse at the base and much denser at the tips. Now I'm just going to simulate that again and just see what it gives us. Now I've got a feeling I'm going to need a lot more particles than what I've got here. So let's make our emission rate really high, let's say 5,000, and see what that does. And you can see straight away that's much denser, and that's the kind of effect I'm going to need to create a decent canopy. Now the other thing I need to bear in mind is I don't want my stems to just grow straight out, and I'm not going to be sculpting these, so I'm going to need to add a little bit of gravity, because obviously these thinner stems are definitely going to be subject to gravity. The default value is just really way too strong, so let me just try 0.2 minus 200 millimeters per second. And I think the thing to do at this point is let's just actually compute the simulation and see what the generated curves are going to look like. So I think that's going to be way too much, but nonetheless I'm going to go to Dynamics, convert particle cache to curves, just so I can actually see the result. It's going to take a few seconds to calculate, so I'll just pause the video while this finishes. So this is the result, and you can see that well, it's way too dense, so I'm going to need to reduce the particle count. They're coming out way too fast, so I'm going to need to reduce the velocity, and also I'm not really seeing the effect of the gravity, so I think I reduced the effect of gravity way too much. So let's simply undo that last operation, and let's increase this gravity amount. Let's try minus 800. Obviously it's going to be baby steps. There's going to be a bit of tweaking. There always is in these kind of cases. I'm going to reduce my emission rate to say 1,000 for now. And I'm going to reduce the initial velocity to say 50. Once again, I'm just going to calculate the simulation. You can see that is much more modest. Now this time I think I've dialed it all back too much, especially the velocity, because this isn't going to give me much of a canopy. I can see just by the distribution of particles I don't really have enough of a canopy here. So let's try 200 maybe and recompute this simulation. Seems to be more satisfactory. Once again I'm going to convert that to curves, so I need to make sure I've got my particle simulation selected. Go to Dynamics, convert particle cache particles to curves. With a lower count it's much quicker. So again, I'm still not quite there. It's going to take me quite a bit of toing and froing obviously to get the right result. I think it's probably not dense enough. They're still a little bit too long and they're too straight. So once again, let's undo that last operation. Let's try -2 for my gravity. I can see I made a schoolboy error actually with my gravity, and I apologize for that, but what I actually need to do, let me tick this box that says use gravity, and all of a sudden, let's just recalculate the sim without actually changing anything. You can see the gravity now is really strong because all the particles are really falling very fast. So let's reduce the strength to maybe 20, and let's recompute that sim very quickly. That seems to be a little bit better. So with that done, once again, I'm going to convert the particle cache to curves and see what that gives me. Right, so I think I can have my gravity a little bit stronger. Obviously, I've still got the problem that I don't think my canopy is dense enough, and I also think these stems are way too long. But once again, it's a process of trial and error. So let's undo that. Let's make the gravity -50. And let's go back to my curve emitter. I need to reduce the velocity and increase the emission rate. So let's try 2000, recalculate the sim. And yeah, the distribution seems reasonable to me. These are just the stems, and all of the stems will begin growing several leaves because I'm going to add another particle system on top of that. So once again, let's have a look at the particle cache. I need to select the particle simulation item and then convert that to curves once again. Now I've increased, obviously, the particle density. It's taking a little longer to calculate. Okay, I still think these stems are too long. Yeah, they're way too long actually. So let's undo that once again. Go to my curve emitter. Let's reduce the velocity spread because that's basically causing a difference in velocity between some of the particles. Let's just recalculate having just changed that, and you can see straight away that's bringing the particles closer to the branches. I am going to reduce the velocity down to 50, and let's recalculate. Obviously, it's a balancing act because I've got to make sure my canopy is big enough, and I can see here I'm starting to really shrink it down, and my leaves are going to be very close to the branches. So let's bring it back up to 80, and I might actually have to generate the leaves and have a look at that. So it seems a good point to do that. I'm going to reselect my particle simulation, go to dynamics, convert particle cache to curves once again. And that's created some nice stems, and you can see that we can really see the effect of gravity. So I'm just going to select this mesh, and I'm just going to rename it stems, and I'll probably parent it to the branches later on. So once again, I need these to be render curves, and I'm going to make the curve radius smaller than my branches. So if my branches was at 10 millimeters, yes, anything between 2 and 5 millimeters will do for these. Let's set it to 3 for now. And what I'm going to do now is, seems a good time to save actually. And let's bear with me while this saves. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my curve emitter, and now I'm going to select my stems as the particle source, and let me just calculate that. And you can see now the particles are coming from the stems, and this time I really do want my emission rate to be much higher. But I'm going to go back to my particle sim. I'm going to remove gravity. I'm going to go to the curve emitter once again. I'm happy with this distribution curve that I want to keep. I'm going to set my velocity to 0 because I want my particles to be static. And this time I really am going to increase my emission rate very, very high. And let's just calculate that. Okay, so this has created all my particles on my tree. And now I can finally create the replicator that's going to create the leaves. So I'm going to go to Add Item Particles Replicator. As my prototype, I'm going to select the group with the leaves that we created earlier. And as my point source, I'm going to select the particle simulation. And as I do this, you can see that the leaves now appear on the tree. However, the first thing you'll notice is that their orientation is very unnatural at the moment because they're all completely horizontal, and it just doesn't look like leaves really would look in a tree. So what I need to do is to orient these leaves to mimic the way that they would grow out of the stems, and luckily there is an assembly in the standard Modo content that will do just that for me. So I'm going to go to the particle simulation in the item list, and in the schematic I'm going to click on add selected just to add that. You can expand these yellow dots if you want. It doesn't really matter as long as the operators of the particle simulation are visible in the schematic. That's all you need. So next I'm going to hit F6 to open my preset browser, and in your standard content, if you go to assets, assemblies, particles, you'll see that there's this really useful align to velocity assembly. So I'm going to drag that into my schematic view. And all I need to do is to get the particle operator output from here, connect it to the operator input on my particle simulation. And I'm just going to go back to the curve emitter, and I'm just going to add a tiny bit of initial velocity. So let's go for 0.1 just to make a tiny amount. And I'm just going to recalculate the simulation. And you can see that that's now created a much more believable pattern for my foliage. I think that the velocity is a little bit too high, so I'm just going to reduce that. Let's reduce it all the way down to 1 millimeter per second so that it's really subtle. But the benefit actually of having more velocity, so it is worthwhile tweaking this if you want, is it will expand your canopy a little bit. So you've got quite a bit of control at this final stage here of the final shape of your canopy. So it could be that the value I'm entering now is going to be too small, but the only way to find out is to actually calculate it and see what it looks like. And actually, to me, that seems pretty good. The only thing that I'm not that happy with, it seems a lot of these stems don't have enough leaves growing on them. So I'm going to increase my emission rate to, let's say, 8,000. Obviously, that's going to create a lot more leaves. I'm also going to change the random seed just to shake things up a little bit. Recalculate once more. And that seems to be a little bit better. There seems to be more leaves growing on these stems that I've generated. And next I'm going to select the replicator item itself, and I'm going to add a bit of variation in that. So let's add some random twists. So let's try 360 in the X, and let's try 360 in the Z as well, so that's going to shift things about. I probably want to have a little bit of random scale. Let's just do a tiny amount. That's way too much. Let's try 10%, maybe 20%, just so that not all the leaves are exactly the same size. That seems pretty good to me. And with this done, this seems a pretty good time to open preview. So I'm going to hit F8. Launch preview and just wait for it to update. Just pause the video while this cleans up. So with preview now complete, I can have an initial look at my results, and I can see there's a few things I need to change. So the first thing is these stems are way too thick, so I'll reduce their thickness now. I'm going to make the curve radius 2 millimeters for now. The other thing is, I think I need a lot more leaves, so let's go to my curve emitter, and let's just put this, let's double this to 16,000. And I'm going to increase my initial velocity to 10 just to make the canopy spread out a little bit more. So this means that I need to recalculate my sim. I'll do that now. And once again, I'm just going to pause the video while I update preview. And this is my updated preview. And I think once again, I need to make a couple more adjustments. So let's go back to my emission rate. I'm going to increase this velocity up to 100. And again, I'm going to, let's increase this to 20,000 now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to recalculate the sim and update preview. And so, as you can see, gradually I can slowly sculpt the shape that I want. Obviously, the leaves are always going to cluster around the branches, and this is what would obviously happen in a real tree, but I can use the particle sim to really control this distribution. So I'm going to keep tweaking. I'm now going to change my inner radius to 300 millimeters. I'll bring my velocity back down to 10 where it was before, and once again I'll update the sim and update preview. So I've done a little bit more tweaking since I last ran the video, and I've increased my inner radius to 500 millimeters, and I've reduced my initial velocity down to 1 millimeter, and this given me this result, and I'm more or less happy with it. There's a few outliers here that I'm not happy with, but overall I think the shape is pretty good. But what I can do is now I can freeze this latest particle system that I've just created to a point cloud, and use these sculpting tools to just shape it a bit more. The other issue is that there's these sort of disembodied leaves, and that's one of the reasons why I don't like having these outliers too separated from the main canopy, because obviously the fact that they're not attached by any stems is going to be really obvious. The other issue I'd like to bring up is that these stems look a little bit unnatural at the moment, but that's really down to their shading. Once I shade them in a different color, something more brownish or greenish as opposed to white, they'll blend in with the tree a lot more, and they'll actually add quite a nice bit of extra detail. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close preview down, and I'm going to select my particle simulation, and I'm going to go to Dynamics, Convert Particle Cache to Cloud. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect my replicator to this cloud, this point cloud I've just created. And I'm going to switch to my Paint tab, and I'm going to look at editing this particle system with the particle paint tools in order to control the shape a little bit better. So I'm going to select my point cloud, and in item mode I'm going to hit Shift H just to hide everything else, and make sure I toggle verts on so that I can see the actual point cloud. And now if I select some particle paint tools, I should be able to edit this point cloud. So I'm going to right click in the viewport, and let's just push some of these outliers back into the main canopy. So you can see that this gives me that little bit of extra flexibility to edit the canopy that I've just created. And obviously I can use the other tools in the particle paint in order to control the shape of my canopy. Let's just push these all back in. If I hold Shift, it does smoothing. She doesn't like the video capture running while I do this. You can see that my cursor's gone into the spin of death mode. So I'm just going to pause the video while this catches up with me. So having used the move tool to push some of these outliers back into the main canopy, I'm going to switch to the pinch tool, and by holding down Control I can make it do the reverse operation, which is basically to sort of expand the particles. And I'm just clicking very rapidly because I don't want to do this, don't want this operation to be too heavy, but I'm just holding down Control and just quickly sort of clicking in the center of some of these areas of particles, just to expand them outwards a little bit and just thicken my canopy. Oops, let me undo that. Thicken my canopy just a little bit. So once again, I'm just going to pause the video while I continue shaping this particle cloud. And this is the result of my latest session using the particle sculpting tools to shape the canopy. And you can see that with the move tool and the pinch tool, I use the pinch tool both in expand mode and in pinch mode. You can really precisely shape your canopy. I've managed to control all the outliers that were here at the top, and I've been able to basically reshape all of the leaves that are forming in the canopy and make them follow the branches that have been created, and just create and essentially design a shape that was pleasing to me. So I'm going to stop here, but you can see that you have the power really to take this wherever you want to. But I think at this point I'm going to say that the leaves have been created, and I'm going to move on to shading the trunk and branches of the tree. So I've switched to my render tab and I've selected my trunk, my branches and my stems, and I'm going to hit the M key and I'm going to create a new material, call it bark, and I'm putting the diffuse value at 60% and the specular at 0. So the reason that my diffuse value is at 60% is basically to allow for the fact that quite a large portion of the light hitting the tree is going to be absorbed, essentially making the tree quite dark. So at this stage, I'm going to need some reference in order to correctly create the bark. So I've taken this picture in my local park, and I quite like this bark. I quite like the fact that it's got this variation with the sort of the white part of the bark, and then below it there's a sort of green and brown areas. And I think this is going to make for a very interesting texture. Now I'm going to create all of this procedurally because well, two reasons. If I want to duplicate my trees, I don't want the texture to be duplicated. So if I have procedural textures, this is very easy to do. And the other thing is that when you've got something that's a complex organic shape like a tree, you don't really want to have to get involved with UV mapping it, not unless it's a very important asset. But if it's something that's just going to be in the background of a scene, you don't want to have to spend the time creating a UV map on an object like this. So procedural textures just make for a much better workflow. The drawback with them is that it can be quite a lot of work to get a realistic result, because a lot of procedural textures look very computer generated, whereas photographic textures or hand painted textures are much easier to make in a realistic and organic way. But I think it's worth the time and effort just because it will save time in other ways. So, as I'm sure you're aware, Modo comes with a large variety of procedural textures under the eModo enhanced Modo textures. And a good tip to know is that if you type eModo in the docs, you can actually get to a visual overview of them. And this is what I use all the time when I'm choosing which one of these eModo textures to use. So for a bark, I'm going to be wanting to look in the organic or the noise categories, and there's two that I use quite a lot. Well, the one I use the most is this one here, the etched. I find this one really useful because there's a really great natural variation in the shape and size of the noise. But for my initial texture here, I am going to be looking at a different one, and I'm going to be looking at this one, the multifractal. And this is the one I'm going to use to create my initial underlying bark. So this will be these areas here, the brown and green ones in my reference image. So to begin, I'm going to select my bark material in the shader tree and go to Add Layer, Enhance Modo Textures, Noise, and then I'm going to select Multifractal. That should apply it to my tree straight away. I'm going to reduce the texture locator, so I'll start with a value of 0.1, and if I hold down Control when I hit Enter, it should create it proportionally. I'm now going to hold down Shift and use my scroll wheel to zoom in on my preview, and I think I'm going to reduce this a little bit more. Let's reduce it to 50 and hold down Control one more time. And now what I'm going to do is stretch it in the Y. So let's just multiply the Y value by 10 by adding a 0, and you can see that's creating a nice kind of bark effect. I might just dial the stretching down a little bit, so let's do it to 300. That seems pretty good. And now I'm just going to add the colors. So if I go back to my reference image, I can see that the underlying bark has got areas of green and brown. So these are the colors that I need to enter in my background and foreground values in my noise texture. So I'll start with the brown, which I'll put in the background color slot. So I just need to bring the lightness up just a fraction and then use a very, very desaturated dark sort of orangey red. I need to just bring it up a touch more. Be very careful with the saturation because these kind of organic colors are always very desaturated. And now I'll work on the green. So once again, I'll just dial the brightness down and then use a yellowy green with very low saturation. Probably need to make it a bit darker. That's probably the kind of effect. Maybe I can afford a smidge more saturation, but we've got to be very delicate here because really you need to keep the saturation very low. Now, if I return to my reference image, I can see that the green is much more prominent than the brown. So I need to adjust the bias and gain to try and mimic this. So let's reduce the bias down to 25 and see what that does. Well, that's going the wrong way, so let's increase it to 75. That's more or less having the desired effect. Let's try 65. It seems to work quite well. So now I will tweak the gain, which is like a contrast control. Let's put that up to 75. It's probably getting there. I might need to increase the octaves a bit just so there's a bit more variation. So let's try 6 octaves. It's probably a bit too strong. Let's dial it down to 5. That's reasonably good, actually. I think for a starting point, the only thing I'd be tempted to do now is just to reduce this a little bit further. So let's try reducing this by 20. And now you can see we're getting a bark-like effect. If I return to my texture layers, I think the green probably needs to be a little bit darker, actually. That's more subtle. And I might also do the same with the brown, just make it a little bit darker. But that seems a reasonably good starting point. And next I'm going to create an instance of the multifractal map and set the effect to surface shading displacement. Now, in order to get the displacement to actually work in preview, I'm going to have to hold down Shift to zoom out, and I'm going to zoom in again, but this time actually zooming the camera, and hopefully I can get a better, more accurate preview of my displacement by doing this. If I turn draft displacements off and set it to extended refinement passes, let me just see if I can get my displacement to render. Might need to reset this render, start again. Right, you can see now I'm getting a more accurate preview of my displacement. The displacement's way too strong, so I'm going to go back to the material and let's reduce it. Let's try 5 to start with. Okay, so in the instance texture, I'm going to change the background color to pure black, and I'll change the foreground to pure white. And I'm also going to increase the gain a little bit more so that the contrast is greater. So we've got a sort of a sharper transition between the sort of raised parts and the lowered parts. That's the kind of effect I'm looking for. I'll just pause it now. So next I'm going to try and recreate these white areas on the bark. So to start with, I'm going to go to Add Layer, Enhance Modo Textures, Noise, and I'm going to select Etched. And that should override the diffuse value that I've got here. I can't really see the pattern yet, so I think my texture locator needs to be reduced. So I'll type in 0.6, and you can see now we start to see the pattern appearing. Now, the easiest way to control the distribution of the etched texture is to play with the corrosion. So I'm going to enter a value of 5 there, and you can see that makes quite a drastic change. And next I'm going to increase the gain so there's more contrast in the pattern, and you can see that has a pretty good effect. And I can control the distribution of the dark and light areas by adjusting the bias. So I'm going to reduce that to 20, and you can see that that's creating quite a nice effect now. So I'm going to add another layer on top of that, just a simple noise texture this time. This just has some variation in the white part of the diffuse. I'm going to reduce the size of the locator to 0.5. You can see the variation now appears in the viewport. And I'm going to turn the background color up a bit because I don't really want it to be black. It's just some very, very subtle variation in color now. I'm going to return to my etched texture, and I'm going to change the effect from diffuse color to shader control layer mask. And you can see as I do this, the dark areas are now revealing the bark underneath, and the light areas are revealing the noise that is above. So the next step is to also create some displacement based on these white patches. So what I'm going to do is create an instance of this etch pattern. I need to move it away from the noise because at the moment this is acting as a layer mask for this layer here. So this original etch layer needs to be directly underneath it. So let's select the instanced etched layer and I'm going to change the effect to surface shading displacement. Now this is obviously going to override this displacement map that I've got here. You'll see once preview refreshes that just going to take a second, that the original bark has now gone flat, but it's easy to fix this by changing the blend mode. I'm going to change it to add, and now what's going to happen is it's going to preserve my original displacement map, which is here, but these white areas here will be overridden and these will be raised up. So as you can see, this is working quite well. I might just increase my gain a little bit more just to make the contrast in this displacement map a little bit sharper, so the transitions are sharper. And I think that's actually working quite well. So the question of how far you should be taking this shading process really depends on how close you are likely to get to the bark of this tree, because I think for a close-up this is definitely not realistic enough. I would need to do quite a bit more work to add more details, some bump maps, that kind of thing onto this. But if the tree is going to be seen from a distance, all that work would obviously be wasted. So the best thing to do is I'm just going to switch to camera view and simply zoom out and look at the bark from the distance it's likely to be seen. And I honestly think that from this kind of distance, it works well enough. Now, if I'm planning to duplicate this tree, I'd like to be able to duplicate it without the texture being repeated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of my procedural textures, and I'm going to go to texture locator, and I'm going to go world coordinates. And what this will do is that if this is replicated, it will make sure that the patterns aren't repeated. The one disadvantage is that if the items are animated, the textures will be seen to swim. So you have to make sure that you only ever do this for static items. But obviously things like trees are very unlikely to ever be animated, so it should work just fine. So I've added a physical sun and sky and done a render of my tree, and this is the result. And with the techniques that I've shown you in this tutorial, you should be able to recreate more or less any deciduous tree. So the steps to remember are that in order to create the main trunk and the main branches, I use sketch extrude with some taper and twist. And then to create the smaller branch details, I then used mesh paint. Finally, for the very small branches and twigs, I used the particle system in conjunction with the particles to curves function. And finally, the foliage was created with the particle system and then further edited with the particle paint tools that are found in the paint tab. And you can see that with all these techniques added together, you have a lot of control over the final design of your tree.